I'll never forget the way the air changed that day. As if the world itself held its breath. We were sitting side by side. The noise of the cafe fading into the background until it felt like we were the only two people left in existence. I had spent months pretending, convincing myself that this was nothing more than a friendship. That the spark I felt whenever Liam looked at me wasn't anything more than my imagination running wild. But that day, it all shattered. He reached over the table, his fingers brushing against mine. And for the first time, the casual touch felt like an electric jolt, as if the universe was reminding me that I had been denying myself something essential. His eyes, the kind of brown that felt like warm earth, looked into mine with a depth I couldn't quite place. And for the first time, I didn't pull away, didn't shrink back in fear of whatever I was feeling. It was one of those moments when time bends, and suddenly everything in you screams that something life-changing is about to happen, even though you don't fully understand it. Then, as if reading my mind, he let out a small laugh, a sound I'd come to treasure in the silence of my thoughts. "I've been waiting for you to figure it out," he said softly, the words carrying a weight that sent a chill down my spine. "I know you've been holding back, pretending not to feel this." His voice wasn't accusatory, there was tenderness there. The kind of understanding that cuts through the noise and directly into the heart. I froze. Had I been that obvious? Was I that easy to read? He leaned in slightly, the tension between us palpable, and my heart skipped. The idea of a kiss with him had been a fantasy one danced around for so long. One that I'd always kept in the safe corner of my mind where fantasies go to die. But now, here it was, in front of me, alive and real. I could feel the heat of his body just inches from mine. Could smell the faint trace of his cologne. Could hear the soft beating of his heart. And then the moment he reached forward again, his hand cupping my face, pulling me closer. The kiss itself wasn't gentle or hesitant, it was raw, unapologetic, as though he had been holding himself back just as much as I had. When our lips finally met, it was a collision of everything I had buried for so long: desire, confusion, longing, and something deeper, something that felt like coming home after being lost for years. For the briefest of seconds, everything in me clicked, as if every puzzle piece of my existence fell into place. And I knew without a single doubt that this was the moment that would change everything. I had spent so long wondering if I could allow myself to love him. But now, in this kiss, I realized I hadn't been choosing to love him at all. It wasn't a decision, it was simply what was always meant to be. And then, just as abruptly, it ended. He pulled away, but not far enough to break the connection. His hand stayed on my cheek, his thumb stroking the skin like a silent promise. I stared at him, dazed, trying to understand what had just happened. But his next words left me breathless, unraveling everything I thought I knew. "I wasn't waiting for you to fall in love with me. You know," he said quietly, the smile on his lips gentle yet knowing. "I was waiting for you to realize you already were." I didn't know how to respond. I was stunned, still reeling from the kiss, from the weight of everything he had just said. His words hung in the air like a confession, not a declaration, and it made the entire moment feel like it wasn't just about us but about something much bigger. Something I hadn't even been aware of until that exact moment. It was like the truth had always been there, hovering just beneath the surface of every glance, every touch, every conversation we'd had. And now, in one single moment, the floodgates opened, and I was drowning in it. My mind was a whirlwind, scrambling to make sense of everything I had spent so long trying to avoid. This feeling, suppressing it with logic and denial. I told myself we were just friends, that his presence in my life was no more significant than anyone else's. But now, everything shifted. His gaze, the way he held me, the way my heart raced at the mere thought of him. It all screamed that I had been lying to myself. The truth was undeniable. And it hit me harder than anything I could have imagined. I never thought. I stammered, my voice faltering, not knowing how to voice what I was feeling. How could I explain this overwhelming sensation that was unraveling me from the inside out? How could I put into words the emotions that had suddenly flooded my chest, making me feel both incredibly alive and utterly terrified at the same time? I was afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of what would happen if I fully accepted this. If I admitted that I had been in love with him for longer than I could remember. But he wasn't asking for any of that. He wasn't asking me to confess my love or to even admit what had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. His hand moved from my cheek to my arm, his touch soft but grounding, like a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to say anything right now. I've been waiting for you to get there on your own." In that moment, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between the familiar comfort of what I had known for years and the terrifying unknown of what this could become. His eyes never left mine, and there was something in them, something so deep and unwavering, that I could no longer deny. He wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't expecting anything from me. He was just waiting, and the realization hit me like a wave. It wasn't just about him and me anymore. It was about who I had become in the process of loving him, of hiding from it, of fighting it until I couldn't anymore. And then, just as I was about to speak, to finally give voice to the chaos inside me, he stood up. The abruptness of it made my heart skip, and I looked up at him, confused. "Wait, what are you?" I started, but before I could finish, he was already walking away. My pulse raced, confusion gripping my chest as I watched him disappear into the crowd. He didn't even look back. I was left there alone, feeling more exposed than I had ever felt in my life. The warmth of his touch still lingered on my skin, but something had shifted between us. Something that wasn't just about the kiss. Something that I wasn't ready to face. My heart hammered in my chest, torn between wanting to chase after him, to say something, anything, and the paralyzing fear that whatever I said wouldn't be enough. The next few days felt like a blur. My mind replayed that moment over and over, like a song that kept getting stuck in my head. The words, the kiss, the silence that followed, repeating endlessly. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't escape the knot of longing that had lodged itself in my chest. It was all-consuming, and I hated it. I hated how vulnerable I felt, how much of myself I had unknowingly given away in that one instant. He had looked at me as if he knew me better than I knew myself. It terrified me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer just running from him but from myself as well. I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into work, into distractions, anything to avoid confronting the truth that had slapped me in the face. But every time I saw him, my heart would lurch in my chest. He was there in every corner of my world. Even when he wasn't, I'd see him in the smallest things. His laugh echoing in my mind. The way he said my name. That glint of mischief in his eyes. It was maddening. And then, just when I thought I might be able to push it all down and move on, he showed up at my apartment. I wasn't expecting him. I wasn't prepared for him to just walk in. The knock on the door startled me. I hadn't heard from him since that day in the cafe. I had convinced myself I had imagined everything. The kiss, his words, the closeness. I had convinced myself that maybe I had read too much into it. That it was a mistake. That I had made it all up in my head. But standing there, looking at him on the other side of the door, all of that denial crumbled. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, staring at me like he was waiting for me to speak, to make the first move. But I couldn't. My heart was racing again. The same wild rhythm as before. And the weight of his gaze made it impossible to think. The silence stretched between us, thick with tension, until he finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "I don't want to run from this anymore," he said. "I've never wanted to." The simplicity of his words hit me harder than anything else. They were like a confession, a raw admission of everything I had been too afraid to face. He wasn't just talking about us, about the kiss, about the feelings we had shared in that one perfect moment. He was talking about the fear we both carried. Fear of falling, fear of the unknown, fear of everything that might change if we let go. He wasn't waiting for me to come to him. He had already made his choice. And now he was giving me the space to make mine. I swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the weight of the decision that loomed over me. In that moment, I knew that everything I had feared, everything I had avoided, was inevitable. There was no turning back. If I chose him, if I allowed myself to love him, it would change everything. The world I had built around myself, the walls I had so carefully constructed to keep this from happening, would come crashing down. And yet, deep down, I realized I wasn't scared anymore. Not of him, not of us, not of what the future might hold. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could let go. But even as I stood there, the door between us barely opened. Something shifted in the air. I could feel the tension building again, a weight pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I wanted to say something, anything, that would make this moment less suffocating. But instead I found myself stepping back. Not away from him, but into the unknown. And when I looked at him, my heart still beating wildly in my chest, I saw the same fear in his eyes. But also something else, something like relief. It was then that I realized he had been waiting for me to make this decision just as much as I had been waiting for him to make it for me. It wasn't until I stepped back that I realized what I had done. And my heart fell into the pit of my stomach. I had wanted to protect myself so badly that I had almost pushed him away. Pushed away the one person who seemed to understand me in ways I never thought possible. The weight of my own hesitation crashed over me like a wave. And I felt the sudden sting of regret. Why had I pulled away? Why hadn't I just trusted him? Trusted us to figure this out together? He hadn't moved. He stood there silently waiting. His expression unreadable. There was no anger, no frustration, just a quiet understanding. Standing the same look he had given me the first time we shared a space that felt like more than just friendship. It was a look that said he knew exactly how I felt. He knew my fear, but he didn't retreat, and that's what broke me. In that moment, it wasn't his patience that stunned me, but the unspoken promise in the way he simply was. Steady, unwavering, as though he had never once doubted that I would come to this moment. Just as he had never doubted what I meant to him. For the longest time, I had convinced myself that if I just kept my distance, if I just held on to that invisible line between us, I could keep my heart from shattering. But the reality was much harsher than I had prepared myself for. The longer I stood there, the more I realized that I wasn't just denying him, I was denying myself. Denying the chance at something real, something raw, something that could transform both of our lives in ways neither of us could predict. And then, without even thinking, I crossed that line. It wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture. There were no fireworks, no dramatic speeches, no rehearsed words of apology or confession. It was simply me stepping toward him. The decision finally breaking through the fog of doubt and fear that had clouded my mind for so long. I walked to him, close enough to feel the heat of his presence again, close enough to see the subtle flicker of relief in his eyes. His lips parted as if to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. I reached up, cupping his face in my hands, and for the second time, I kissed him. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. The kiss was deeper, fuller, as though everything that had been held back before now poured into that single perfect moment. And in that kiss, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: trust. I was trusting myself, trusting him, trusting the space between us to be a place of safety, not danger. And as the kiss lingered, as the world around us seemed to disappear once more, I realized that it wasn't the kiss that had changed everything. It was the realization that for the first time in my life, I was ready to be loved, just as I had always been ready to love him. The walls I had built around my heart crumbled, not because he had asked me to, but because I finally understood the power of letting go. When we broke apart, there were no words, just the quiet assurance in the way his hands rested on my waist, pulling me closer, as if there was no need to say anything at all. And for the first time, I understood this wasn't the beginning of something, it was the continuation of something that had been there all along. The kiss, the moments, the fear, it was all a part of the journey. And now we were walking it together. The days that followed felt like an entirely new chapter. Though the world around us hadn't changed much at all, the sun still set. The city still hummed with its usual rhythm, but for us, everything felt different. It was as if we had crossed some invisible threshold, one that marked the end of the uncertainty and the beginning of something we could finally claim as our own. We were no longer tiptoeing around each other, avoiding what we were both too afraid to admit. We didn't need to say much anymore. Our actions spoke louder than words. The way he smiled at me across the room, the way our hands naturally found each other in the quiet of the night. It all felt effortless, as if the universe itself had conspired to bring us here, to this moment of perfect alignment. But even with the ease that came with being together, there was a lingering question in the back of my mind. We hadn't talked about the future, about what this meant, about what we wanted. It had always been so easy to fall into the comfort of each other, to lose ourselves in the intimacy we shared. But I knew deep down that we couldn't stay in this bubble forever. There were things we still needed to confront, things we needed to understand about ourselves and about how the world would see us once the truth of us, of this, was out in the open. It was one evening as we walked through the park, our steps in sync and the cool night air wrapping around us like a protective cloak, that he brought it up. His voice was soft, his tone serious, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "I know we haven't talked about it much," he said, pausing to look at me, "but I think we need to start thinking about what happens when we go public. You know, when people find out." I looked up at him, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. The reality of what he was suggesting, of the world knowing the truth of us, made my chest tighten. We had both been living in this quiet space where our love felt like it existed only between us. Away from prying eyes, the thought of sharing it, of exposing it to the scrutiny and judgment of others, terrified me more than anything else. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw that same quiet resolve that had been there since the beginning. It wasn't fear in him. Not the kind I felt, it was something else. Something solid and unshakable. He was ready, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore either. Yes, the world would judge us. Yes, there would be struggles, challenges, and moments where we'd have to stand against forces we couldn't control. But we could face it together. And when I finally spoke, my voice was steady, though my heart was still racing. "We'll figure it out," I said, my words filled with a certainty that surprised even me. Together. And just like that, everything clicked into place. There were no more doubts. No more hesitations. What had started as a single, fleeting moment, the day he kissed me, had transformed into something far greater. It had become the beginning of a journey neither of us could have predicted. But one that, for the first time, felt entirely right. In that kiss, in that moment of undeniable connection, we had found the courage to face everything that came after. And no matter what the world had in store for us, we knew we were ready to walk through it side by side.